Hey guys, what up? Tony here. My heart, my vision, and my passion is to take God's message of purity to the world. The Power of Purity is a 501c3 nonprofit, and like any other ministry, the reach and impact of what we're able to accomplish through the power of purity is predicated upon the finances that we have available. In view of this, we need help. And it's only because of faithful ministry partners like you that the Power of Purity is touching lives literally all around the world. Would you consider making a donation or becoming a monthly partner with this ministry so we can continue to unleash massive amounts of destruction upon the kingdom of darkness? Every dollar you give is tax deductible, and every dollar will be used to advance the healing message of purity to a world that desperately needs it. If you've been touched and encouraged by the Power of Purity, and if you believe in the message of this ministry, would you prayerfully consider becoming a monthly partner? If so, you can visit the Power of Purity website at www.powerofpurity.org, and at the top of the page is a donations link where you can become a vital part of this ministry's impact. Thank you so much for your love, your prayer, and your partnership. God bless you.
Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I really appreciate you being with me today as we continue our current series, which is entitled 12 Things Every Wife Should Know About Her Husband When It Comes to Sex. And I just think that this issue of sex obviously is something that a whole lot of people struggle with very deeply in the context of their marriage, and it can cause a lot of pain and hurt and confusion and disorientation in marriages. So we've been learning that there's some basic principles that men need to understand about their wives when it comes to sex, and there's some basic things that wives need to understand about their husbands when it comes to sex. And I'm hopeful that as we work our way through these principles, that it might bring some insight and encouragement and wisdom and guidance that will help husbands and wives maybe relate to each other and understand each other in a healthier way than ever before. So if you've been with me the past several weeks, you know that we've now covered the first 4 of these 12 principles that every wife should know about her husband when it comes to sex. And in the way of quick review, principle 1 was this: your husband gets tempted in this highly sexualized world. Principle 2, your husband's body has a sexual rhythm. Principle 3, it's hard for your husband to live without sex. Principle 4, your husband would like you to have sex with him. And that brings us to Principle 5, where we continue today. And Principle 5 is this: your husband would like you to want to have sex with him. And just for the sake of absolute clarity, I'm not talking here about you just having sex with your husband, but I'm talking about you actually wanting to have sex with your husband. So the operative word here is the word want. So it has to do with your want to or your desire mechanism. Or said another way, it concerns the issue of your motivation when you have sex with your husband. Are you having sex with your husband because you have to have sex with him? Or are you having sex with your husband because you want to have sex with him? And I think that's a good way to say what I'm trying to talk about here. It has to do with your want to versus your have to. And believe me when I say that you cannot trick your husband, and he will intuitively discern the difference between your want to versus your have to. So in other words, what's the actual motive or energy or attitude or feeling behind your willingness to have sex with your husband. And what I'm saying is that your husband doesn't just want you to have sex with him and doesn't just need you to have sex with him, but he wants you to want to have sex with him. And in order to illustrate the point I'm making here, I'm going to share a silly little metaphor that I think I may have touched on earlier in the podcast at some point. But imagine this. Behind the house where I live, we have a small lake, and I like to fish. And imagine that my youngest son, Samuel, is still at home. He's actually in the Air Force now. We're very proud of him, so he's been gone for over 4 years. But when he was at home, of course, I'd want to spend some time with my son. So I might say, "Hey, Sam, want to go fishing for a while?" And he'd say, "No, thanks, Dad. I don't think I want to today." And so maybe the next day or two, I ask him again, "Hey, Sam, let's go fishing for an hour." "No, thanks, Dad. I'm going to play my video game." And so I ask him a couple days later, "Hey, Sam, do you want to go fishing?" "No, thanks, Dad. I don't want to." And imagine that he continuously declines my invitation. Well, at some point, I'm the dad, and I feel like it's important to spend time with my son, so I'd like to just kind of hang out with him. So at some point, if I wanted to, I could kind of like pull rank on him and say, "Look, Sam, I'm your dad. I want to spend time. I feel like it's important. We don't hang out that much. So I'm not asking you anymore, do you want to go fishing? I'm telling you, you have to go fishing with me." And therefore, I essentially pull rank and I compel him to go fishing with me. And therefore, we get in the boat and we go out on the lake and we fish and we spend some time together. And my point is, how stupid would that be in my estimation? Because what enjoyment would it be for me as a dad to essentially force my son to do this activity with me when I know, in fact, that he doesn't even want to be doing this activity with me, and the only reason that he's participating is basically because he's being compelled to do something that he really doesn't even want to be doing. And if that's the way this whole thing's going down, something in me therefore feels like, well, this isn't fun. I don't enjoy this. This isn't what I want. I don't want you to do this with me because you have to do it. I want you to do it because you want to do it with me. So, guys, I know it's kind of a silly metaphor, but in much the same way, I'm advocating that when a woman actually wants to have sex with her husband, and please, ladies, if you're listening to this, just trust me, it's going to make your husband feel much more loved and understood and seen and affirmed and accepted and respected than almost anything else you could ever do with him or for him, not to mention the fact that it's a very serious turn-on when you want to have sex with him and he knows that you want to have sex with him. And in the same way that a coin has two sides, a heads and a tails, I'd advocate, therefore, that the opposite principle is just as true. As already mentioned in the previous point in our last episode, that if you do not want to have sex with your husband, I'd advocate that this is going to have a seriously negative and harmful effect on your husband. Because if you're willing to have sex with him, but you don't really want to have sex with him, I promise you that he's going to be able to tell the difference concerning your motive, and the fact that you don't really want to have sex with him will be rather emasculating and will most certainly make him feel hurt and disrespected on about the deepest level to his personhood as a man. And by the way, I think the word emasculate is a very appropriate word here because the definition of the word is as follows. Emasculate is to deprive a man of his male role or identity. And I have no doubt that if a man's woman does not want him sexually, that he'll experience that rejection as a profound insult an assault to his very maleness and identity and masculinity and personhood. In my personal situation and story, there was a long time in my marriage when my wife did not want to have sex with me, and in fact, we would go for prolonged periods of time where we did not have sex for months and months and months at a time. And then, as we advanced in our therapeutic process, she eventually came to the place where she was willing to have sex with me, but didn't really want to have sex with me, and that was the best that she could do at that time, and the best that she could offer me was essentially what I've come to call duty sex. And of course, this is when a spouse becomes willing to have sex with their spouse out of a sense of obligation or a sense of duty. I'm having sex with you not because I want to do it, but because I have to do it. It's what Dr. David Snarch calls mercy sex, which means I really don't want to do this with you, but I know that you want to do it, so I'll just go ahead and have mercy on you, and I'll let you have sex with me right now, kind of like throwing a dog a bone. And I think, to be honest with you, that many women might find themselves in this very conflicted place within their marriage, especially Christian women, because they have very little to no desire or interest in sex, yet they know that their husband's a man, and that he wants sex and that he needs sex, and in addition to that, they know that the Bible basically says that they should have sex with their husband. So they find themselves in this position where they're basically feeling compelled to do this thing that they really don't want to do. And as a result, they end up doing it rather reluctantly and half-heartedly out of a sense of duty or obligation, if not resentment and anger. And because of this, they end up bringing their body to the party, but they don't bring their heart to the party, and they don't bring their soul or their joyful willingness and participation. So the experience becomes the difference between Sammy going fishing with me because he has to go fishing with me versus Sammy going fishing with me because he wants to go fishing with me. And let me just say that that difference makes all the difference in the world. And let me just share with you guys a little bit about this concept of duty sex for just a moment from my own personal experience and try to put words to how difficult it was for me to experience duty sex as a man and what a terrible conflict and tension and confusion and disorientation this created in my own mind and heart and soul. And I'm not exactly sure, but I think that maybe a good way to say it is that it put me in this horrible and confusing and tormented place with all these conflicted thoughts and feelings swirling all around on the inside of me, all at the same time. Because, first of all, there's the reality that I am a man, and I do want sex, and I do need sex, and I like sex, and I love sex, and I'm a sexual creature, and I have testosterone flowing through my body, and God made me this way, and I therefore don't have to feel guilty because I'm attracted to my own wife, and I desire my wife, and I want to have sex with my wife. And on top of that, I know that the only person in the world that I'm allowed to have sex with and that I'm supposed to have sex with is my wife. And she's the only person that God wants me to have sex with and the only person that God has blessed me to have sex with. And therefore, there's this part of me that feels like I don't have to feel guilty for wanting to have sex with my wife and for having sex with my wife, because that's exactly what I'm supposed to do and exactly what God wants me to do. So I go ahead and have sex with my wife, even though I know that she's not really that into it and she doesn't really want to be having sex with me, but she knows that she has to have sex with me at least once in a while because we're married and she's my wife and she's a Christian. So she wants to obey God, and she wants to do what she knows God wants her to do, even though she really don't want to do it. And she knows that I'm a man, and therefore she knows that I want sex and need sex. So she essentially, reluctantly, maybe half-heartedly, maybe begrudgingly forces herself to do this thing with me that she doesn't really want to be doing with me. So she brings her body to the party, but she doesn't really bring her heart or her soul or her joyful and willing participation. And as a result, it's like her body's there, but maybe she's not really there, or said another way, she's present and she's not present all at the same time. And maybe she just lays there, and maybe she doesn't really participate, or maybe she participates as little as possible. And you can tell her attitude is basically, just hurry up and get this over with as quickly as possible. So it's a pretty big bummer for a man, because you really want to have sex, and you really need to have sex, and you really want your wife to be into it, but she really isn't into it. So you go ahead and you do it because you kind of feel like you really don't have any other options, because she's the only person you're supposed to do it with, and it's been so long since you've done it the last time, you basically feel like you're going to go crazy if you don't have an opportunity to do it, but at the same time, you feel kind of terrible, and it feels pretty yucky because you know that you're doing it with your wife when she really doesn't want to be doing it. So you're intuitively conflicted because you feel kind of terrible taking sex from your wife when you pretty much know that she doesn't really want to be having sex with you. But at the same time, you know that if you therefore wait until she wants to have sex with you, that you're probably never going to have sex, or it might be a long, long time in between sexual encounters because she basically never wants to have sex. So you feel kind of like a jerk because you feel like you're taking something that you're not sure you should be taking, but at the same time, you feel confused and overwhelmed and conflicted and maybe tormented because you're not sure if the problem is that you're willing to take it or the fact that she's so reluctant to give it. And while we're at it, is if all this isn't already confusing enough, we may as well go ahead and throw some anger and contempt in there, and maybe some resentment, because you feel pretty angry that your wife is so unwilling to participate with you in this event that's really important to you, and it's supposed to be important to both of you and to your marriage. And at the same time, you're feeling pretty hurt and rejected because you know that your wife is basically rejecting you at the most basic and important level that she could possibly reject you. And that feels really bad, and it really sucks. Or if you look that word up in the original Greek language, it really sucketh. So all that to confirm this point, I promise you that it's incredibly important to your husband that you actually want to have sex with him. Not just that you have sex with him, but that you actually want to have sex with him. And believe me when I say there's a huge difference between the two, and your husband will know the difference. So just two more thoughts I want to share with you guys before we finish up this point. And the first one concerns a story I'll go ahead and share with you from my own personal life. And I may have touched on this story before in the context of the podcast, but I'm not exactly sure, so I'm just going to go ahead and share it with you briefly. Sherry and I were at a particular place in our journey, and there was something that I really wanted to be part of our intimacy together, and something that I was really longing for. I might say something that I preferred. And you know how it goes, right? When you don't have something, it makes you want it even that much more. And of course, this something just happened to be something that Sherry really wasn't interested in and didn't really want to be part of our intimacy. So a long time passed, and I'm talking about a period of at least a couple years here. So basically what happened here is that Sherry made a unilateral decision that we were not going to do this particular thing. because she wasn't really interested. And of course, I had no option but to respect that because she didn't want to do it. She wasn't interested in it. And therefore, of course, I'm not going to coerce her or force her to do something that she doesn't want to do or that she's not interested in. So it's something that was just absent. And even though I had this interest and desire, it was just something that was outside of our reach, and therefore something that I just had to kind of come to peace with and try to be okay with. Well, a long time passed, and I'm talking about a period of at least several years here. And one night, Sherry and I were out for dinner, and we hadn't talked about this particular subject in a long time. So I went ahead and I brought it up because it was something that was important to me and something that I thought about on a pretty regular basis. So I started the conversation with a kind of disclaimer, and I told her that I wanted to talk about this issue, but the very first thing I wanted her to know is that I was fine, and if this thing never, ever happened again as part of our intimacy, that I'd be okay. And I didn't want to pressure her. I didn't want to make her do something that she didn't want to do. But at the same time, I wanted her to know that this thing was important to me and that I'd really like for this particular thing to happen, even if it could happen only 1 or 2 times a year. And I told her I didn't want her to do this thing just for me, even if she was willing to do it just for me. Because if she didn't want to do it, that's capital letters, W-A-N-T. If she didn't want to do it, then I didn't want her to have to do it under any circumstances. And therefore, I told her that what I was asking of her was really much harder than even asking her to do the thing, because I wasn't really asking her just to do the thing, but I was asking her to want to do the thing. So that if it ever happened between us, that it would happen because it's something that we both wanted to happen as part of our intimacy and something that we could both enjoy together, because it was something we were both doing because we both wanted to do it together, and we weren't just doing it because I wanted to do it, but she didn't really want to do it. So my wonderful wife listened to me. She told me that she'd think about it and pray about it. And guess what happened? Absolutely nothing. For a period of time, I'd say maybe 3 or 4 months went by, and I never said another word, and she never said another word, and this thing never happened. And then all of a sudden, one time, we were being intimate, and much to my surprise, my wife actually initiated this thing that I totally wasn't expecting. But that, of course, I totally enjoyed because I could tell for real that she wasn't just doing it for me because I wanted to do it, but she was doing it because she wanted to do it, and I could tell that she was totally wanting to do this, and she was totally into it, which was totally awesome and mind-blowing, like electric sex that I talked about in episode 23 of the podcast. And I'll just tell you guys, I still don't know how my wife did it. But somehow Sherry was able to find her want to instead of just her have to, because she knew that I wanted her to want to do it if we were going to do it, and somehow that's exactly what she did. And I just want to tell you guys that this situation, as it unfolded, made me just so deeply appreciate my wife, and I feel like I fell even more deeply and madly and passionately in love with my wife because of it. So don't tell me that his wife's want to doesn't matter to a man, because I think, and I know from personal experience, that it makes all the difference in the world when a man knows that his wife wants to have sex with him. And thus this very point which states, your husband would like you to want to have sex with him. And that brings me to the final thought I wanted to share with you before we leave this point, which is something like this. If you're in the place for whatever reason where you simply do not want sex with your spouse most of the time, or even some of the time as far as that goes, I just want to inspire hope in you that change and growth is possible. And because you haven't wanted to have sex for a long time, and maybe you've been in this place where you just aren't that interested, and it's very difficult for you, I just believe with all my heart that we don't necessarily have to stay where we've been for a long time, that God wants to bring health and healing and growth and wholeness and grace and mercy to our lives, and He wants to help us be healthier in our relationship with ourself. He wants us to be healthier in our relationship with our own body. He wants us to be healthier in our relationship with sex. He wants us to be healthier in our sexual relationship in our marriage. And I just believe that God can help us to grow and to change and to be healthier. So I just want to encourage that hope in you that it is possible to learn to want to have sex again. It's possible to learn to desire and long and to enjoy sex with your spouse again. And I just believe with all my heart that that's exactly what God intends for us as married couples, that God intends for sex to be a wonderful, beautiful, awesome, mysterious, and delicious gift that He's given us, and it's something that He wants us to enjoy, and He wants us to luxuriate and to indulge and to please one another and to enjoy pleasure with one another. And God does not want us to continue to live in a place that's wounded and broken and dysfunctional and unhealthy, and that God, through His mercy, His grace, His healing and redemption, can work deeply and powerfully in our hearts, in our lives, in our relationship, in our marriage, and He can help us move toward this hope and this healing and this redemption. Praise be to God. And I mentioned this previously, but if you're in a very difficult place like that, I might encourage you to consider listening to episodes 43 through 48 of the Power of Purity podcast, a series I did entitled When You or Your Spouse Doesn't Like Sex. And in those episodes, I talk about the 4 primary reasons that typically cause people to not want to have sex with their spouse in the context of their marriage, but then what they can do about it, how to process those 4 reasons and try to do some work and get in a place where you can be in a healthier place in your relationship with yourself and your relationship with your sexuality, and then in relationship with your spouse. And let me just say this, that in my estimation, it's not okay for a couple to be sexually dysfunctional. It's not okay when a person does not want or desire sex with their spouse, because I do believe, and maybe you disagree with me, but I just believe that it's God's plan and design and will and ideal that sex should be a wonderful, beautiful, awesome, delicious, mysterious, spiritual, satisfying, and fulfilling experience between a husband and a wife. And God's plan, design, will, and ideal is that a married couple experience the closeness and connection and union and intimacy and oneness that's intended to occur in and through the conjugal union between them. So I'd suggest that your sexual relationship with your spouse is just like your car. If something's wrong and something isn't running right and something's misfiring or something's broken or out of alignment, you need to get the car into the shop. You need to figure out what's wrong. You need to get the problems corrected so the car can run properly. Or said another way, if you're in the place where you don't want to have sex with your spouse, or you're unable to participate sexually with your spouse for whatever reasons, whether you're a man or a woman, the problem isn't always the sex part, and sometimes the problem is the want to part. So I just highly recommend that you do the work necessary to figure out why you don't want to have sex with your spouse, and then work on and work through those issues so you can get to the place where you actually want to have sex with your spouse, and you can actually enjoy having sex with your spouse the way God always intended it to be. And by the way, if you're listening to this podcast, you already know our story, but I encourage you to please let our story, the story of Tony and Sherry and Gracia, inspire hope in you, because the fact is we were an absolute mess for at least the first 10 to 12 years of our marriage, and we were very sexually dysfunctional, and we almost never had sex, and I had a sexual addiction, and my wife had a sexual aversion, and if and when we did have sex, at the very best, it was typically duty sex, because my wife was typically doing it because she had to do it, and not because she wanted to do it. And as our story unfolded, I became involved in several different adulterous affairs, and our marriage and our family was literally on the brink of total destruction. And we finally started going to counseling, and we began this therapeutic process that lasted for over 6 years, and it was profoundly difficult, but also profoundly redemptive, and God gave us what I might call a slow miracle, and He brought His light and His truth, His healing, His redemption, His mercy, His grace, His forgiveness, His salvation into our hearts and our lives and our marriage, and even into our sexual selves, and then into our sexual relationship with one another. Praise be to God. And I can tell you now that it was absolutely worth the fight, because today we're happier, and we're healthier, and we're more whole, and we're more madly and passionately in love with each other than we've ever been, and we're best friends, and we actually enjoy being with each other, and we miss each other when we're not together. And I can tell you that our marriage is like a fine wine, because it gets better and better all the time. So please, if you're in the place that for whatever reason you're unable to enjoy sex with your spouse, and you do not want to have sex with your spouse, let our story inspire hope in you, and I promise you that if you're willing to do the work, that God will give you the same miracle that He gave my wife and I. And I'll just finalize this point by saying that I have no doubt whatsoever that it is God's will for you and your spouse to have a healthy and fulfilling sexual relationship. And God is standing by, and He's ready, and He's willing, and He's able to help you and your spouse deal with your issues so you can get to a healthier place with each other sexually, and you can come to the place where you actually do desire and you do want to experience and enjoy sexual intimacy with your partner on a regular basis. Praise be to God. And with that being said, it brings us to our next point of the 12 things that every wife should know about her husband when it comes to sex, which is this, principle number 6. And if you want to know what it is, you're going to have to come back next week to the Power of Purity podcast, because I see from the clock that we are out of time for this particular episode. So I'm going to have to go ahead and conclude this episode today. So I want to thank you for being with me. I pray that what we talked about might be encouraging and helpful and offer some light and guidance as you continue to move forward on the healing path that God has intended for your heart, your life, your sexuality, and for your marriage. So thanks for listening in, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week at the next episode of the Power of Purity podcast. In the meantime, have an awesome week, you guys. Have an awesome day. Have a blessed day, and I'll see you next week. God bless you. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.